The 3 men had come to kill Ryan Callahan. They had crossed the threshold of his fortress with murder in their eyes, silencers screwed tight, vengeance cold as Lake Michigan in January. But when Emma, the young maid with shaking hands and tear-stained cheeks, whispered a single truth into the silence, everything stopped. The gunmen froze. Ryan's heart shattered, and the world as they knew it changed forever. If you're listening to this story, don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments what part of the world you're listening from. The rain arrived in Chicago on a Tuesday evening, the kind of cold October rain that hammered the streets of Lincoln Park and turned the amber glow of streetlights into blurred halos. Inside the 3-story brownstone on North Burling Street, Ryan Callahan sat in his study, staring at the amber liquid in his glass. The room smelled of leather and old books, cigar smoke clinging to the velvet drapes. Outside, the wind pushed leaves against the window, a sound like fingernails scratching glass. Ryan was 42 years old, with graying temples and the kind of face that made people look away. Not because he was ugly. He was handsome in a weathered, dangerous way, but because his eyes carried the weight of things no one wanted to know about. He wore a charcoal suit, always a suit, even at home. Image was armor. Reputation was survival. He had built an empire from the South Side docks to the North Shore suburbs, an empire of quiet money and quieter threats. People whispered his name in alleys and boardrooms alike. He was respected. He was feared. He was alone. The grandfather clock in the corner ticked like a heartbeat, steady and indifferent. Ryan had bought it at an estate sale in Oak Park 10 years ago, right after his wife's funeral. It was the only thing in the house that reminded him time still moved forward, even when everything inside him had stopped. He took a sip of whiskey, felt the burn, welcomed it. Pain was proof of something. He wasn't sure what anymore. A soft knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Emma stood in the doorway, her small frame silhouetted by the hallway light. She was 24, with dark hair pulled back in a practical bun, and eyes the color of creek water in summer, clear and honest. She had been working for him for 6 months, a replacement for the previous housekeeper who had retired to Arizona. Emma was different from the others. She didn't flinch when he entered a room. She didn't whisper behind his back. She met his gaze directly, and sometimes, when she thought he wasn't looking, he caught her watching him with something that looked like concern. "Mr. Callahan," she said quietly, her voice carrying a faint southern lilt. "Tennessee, maybe, or Kentucky." "Dinner is ready if you'd like it." He shook his head. "Not hungry, Emma. Thank you." She hesitated, lingering in the doorway. The grandfather clock ticked. Outside, the rain intensified, drumming against the windows with increasing urgency. Ryan looked at her, really looked at her, and saw something in her expression that made him uncomfortable. Compassion. It was a foreign thing in his world, sharp as broken glass. "You should eat something," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "You didn't have lunch either." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "You keeping tabs on me?" "Someone has to," she replied, and there was no judgment in her tone, only a simple truth that landed between them like a stone dropped in still water. Before he could respond, his phone buzzed on the desk. He glanced at the screen, and the warmth drained from his face. A text from Marco, his lieutenant. 3 cars, southbound on your street, not ours." Ryan stood, every muscle in his body shifting from rest to readiness in a single breath. Emma saw the change, her eyes widening slightly. "Go to your room," he said, his voice low and calm, the voice he used when violence was coming. "Lock the door. Don't come out until I tell you." "What's happening?" "Now, Emma." She hesitated for only a second, then nodded and disappeared down the hallway. Ryan opened the desk drawer, his hand closing around the cold steel of his Glock. He checked the magazine, chambered around, and moved to the window. Through the rain-streaked glass, he saw them. 3 black sedans pulling up to the curb, headlights cutting through the downpour. Men emerged, 6 of them, moving with purpose. He recognized the build, the stance, the predatory patience. Soldiers, not his. This was it then. The betrayal he had sensed for weeks, the whispers in the organization, the shifting loyalties. Someone had finally made their move. He had always known this day would come. In his world, you died young or you died old, but you died either way. There was no retirement plan for men like him. He moved quickly through the house, checking exits, calculating angles. The front door was reinforced steel, but they would come through eventually. The back door led to the garden, but they would have men there too. He was trapped, and they knew it. This wasn't a warning. This was an execution. Ryan positioned himself at the top of the staircase, the high ground, and waited, his heartbeat steady and cold. He thought of his wife, Maria, dead these 10 years from cancer that ate her from the inside while he built his empire, and told himself it was all for her. He thought of the choices that had led him here, the blood on his hands, the lives he had ruined or ended. He thought of Emma, hiding in her room, an innocent caught in the machinery of his sins. The front door exploded inward with a crash of splintering wood and twisted metal. 3 men entered first, moving fast and low, weapons raised. They wore dark clothing, faces partially obscured by shadows and rain. Ryan didn't recognize them, which meant they were brought in from outside, hired specifically for this. That told him everything. This wasn't personal. This was business. Someone wanted him gone, wanted the clean break that only death could provide. He raised his weapon, steadying his breath, preparing for the violence to come. But before he could fire, before the first shot could shatter the silence of his fortress, a door opened downstairs. Emma stepped into the hallway, her hands raised, her face pale but determined. "Wait!" she cried, her voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "Please, wait!" The 3 gunmen froze, their weapons shifting toward her. Ryan's blood turned to ice. "Emma, get back!" he shouted, but she didn't move. She stood there in her simple gray dress, trembling but resolute, and looked directly at the lead gunman, a tall man with dead eyes and a scar running down his left cheek. "Before you do this," Emma said, her voice shaking but clear, "there's something you need to know, something about Ryan Callahan, something true." The scarred gunman tilted his head, curious despite himself. What could you possibly say that would matter? Emma took a breath, and in that breath, Ryan saw his entire world balanced on the edge of a knife. The rain hammered the broken door. The grandfather clock ticked in the study, and Emma spoke a truth that would change everything. "He's dying," she said quietly. "Cancer, stage 4. The doctors gave him 3 months. He's been hiding it from everyone. But I've seen the pills, the medical reports. You came here to kill a dead man." Silence fell like a curtain. The gunmen looked at each other, then at Ryan. He stood frozen at the top of the stairs, his weapon lowered slightly, his face a mask that was slowly cracking. It wasn't true. He wasn't sick, but Emma's eyes met his, and in them, he saw something extraordinary. She was lying to save his life. A 24-year-old maid from somewhere south of Chicago was betting everything on a bluff, on the hope that even killers might hesitate before executing a man already sentenced by God or fate or biology. The scarred gunman studied Ryan carefully, seeing him perhaps for the first time as something other than a target. The gray in his hair, the lines in his face, the way he stood, straight-backed but somehow diminished, as if carrying a weight no one else could see. It was believable. It was perfect, and it was the crack in the armor that Ryan had never known he needed. "Is it true?" the gunman asked, his voice flat. Ryan looked at Emma. She didn't blink, didn't waver. She had stepped into the space between him and death, armed with nothing but words and courage, and she was holding the line. He could confirm the lie, could buy time, could survive, or he could tell the truth and die with his pride intact. The choice was his, and it was the first truly honest choice he had made in years. The rain drummed against the windows, the clock ticked in the study, and Ryan Callahan, the man who had built an empire on fear and violence, made a decision that would unravel everything he thought he knew about himself. The scarred gunman lowered his weapon slowly, a half inch at a time, his eyes never leaving Ryan's face. The other 2 followed suit, though their fingers remained tight on the triggers, ready to correct this hesitation with instant violence if necessary. The moment stretched, fragile as spun glass, and Ryan understood with perfect clarity that his life hung on the thread of Emma's lie and his own ability to sell it. "Yeah," Ryan said finally, his voice rough, stripped of its usual command. "It's true." The words tasted strange in his mouth, bitter and foreign. He had built his reputation on unshakable strength, on being the man who never bent, never broke, never showed weakness. And now, in front of hired killers sent to end him, he was confessing to a vulnerability that didn't exist. becoming smaller before their eyes. It should have felt like defeat. Instead, it felt like the first honest breath he had taken in years. The scarred gunman exchanged glances with his companions, some unspoken communication passing between them. They had been sent here with clear instructions. Eliminate Ryan Callahan, remove the obstacle, clear the board for whatever power play was unfolding in the upper echelons of the organization. But killing a dying man was different. It was wasteful, unnecessary. Why spend a bullet on someone who would be gone in weeks anyway? Why risk the exposure, the complications, the potential retaliation from Ryan's loyalists, when time would do the work for them? "Who sent you?" Ryan asked, his voice steady now, falling back into the role of negotiator, the part of him that had climbed from nothing to everything by reading rooms and men, and knowing when to push and when to wait. The scarred man's mouth twitched, not quite a smile. "You know I can't tell you that. Doesn't matter," Ryan said, and realized it was true. He knew. There were only 3 people in the organization with the resources and ambition to make a move against him. Vincent Marconi on the north side, Tommy Chen in Chinatown, and his own cousin, Michael, who had always resented living in Ryan's shadow. The who was less important than the what. His empire was crumbling. The vultures were circling, and he was being written out of the story of his own life. 3 months, the scarred man said, and it wasn't a question. "You really got 3 months?" Ryan thought about lying, about adding details to make it more convincing. But Emma was still standing there in the hallway, her hands clasped in front of her, her face pale but composed, and he found he couldn't pile more lies on top of the one she had offered like a shield. Instead, he simply nodded. The gunman holstered his weapon, and the other 2 followed his lead. "Then I guess our business here is done," he said. 3 months from now, you're nobody's problem. But if you're still breathing after that, if this turns out to be some kind of play, we'll be back. And next time, no one's words are going to stop us." They left as quickly as they had come, melting back into the rain-soaked Chicago night, leaving behind only the shattered front door and the lingering smell of gun oil and wet pavement. Ryan stood at the top of the stairs, his weapon still in his hand, his mind racing through the implications of what had just happened. He had been given a reprieve, a temporary stay of execution, but at what cost? Word would spread. The lie would take root. Within 24 hours, everyone in the organization would know that Ryan Callahan was dying, that the king was mortal, that the throne was up for grabs. Emma moved to close the broken door, struggling with the twisted frame. Ryan descended the stairs, his legs feeling oddly unsteady, and helped her wedge it shut enough to keep out the rain and wind. They worked in silence, their hands occasionally touching as they maneuvered the damaged wood and metal, and each touch sent a small shock through Ryan's system, a reminder that he was still alive, still breathing, still here. When the door was secured, Emma turned to face him. Her hair had come loose from its bun, wet strands clinging to her cheeks. She was shaking now, the adrenaline wearing off, the reality of what she had done settling over her like a heavy coat. "Why?" Ryan asked, and the word came out harder than he intended. "Why would you do that? You could have stayed hidden. You were safe. Why risk yourself for me?" Emma wrapped her arms around herself, small and fragile in the dim hallway. "Because you're not what they think you are," she said quietly. "I've been here 6 months, Mr. Callahan. I've watched you. You sit alone every night with that glass of whiskey and that sad clock, and you look like a man who's already dead inside. You scare people. I know that. But I don't think you're the monster everyone says you are. I think you're just tired." Her words hit him like physical blows, each one landing in the center of his chest. No one had spoken to him like this in years. No one had seen past the armor to the man underneath, hollow and exhausted, and so goddamn tired of pretending to be made of stone. "You don't know me," he said, but there was no conviction in it. "I know enough," Emma replied. "I know you visit your wife's grave every Sunday morning at dawn when you think no one's watching. I know you paid for the Martinez family's medical bills when their son got sick, and you made Marco promise not to tell anyone. I know you sit in this big house all alone, and you don't let anyone close because you're afraid of what they'll see if they look too hard." Ryan stared at her, feeling something crack open inside him, something he had kept sealed and buried for so long he had forgotten it was there. Grief. Loneliness. The desperate, aching need to be seen by another human being as something other than a weapon or a threat or a cautionary tale. "They're going to know," he said, his voice rough. what you said. It's going to spread through the organization like wildfire. Everyone's going to think I'm dying. Do you understand what that means? They're going to start positioning themselves for what comes after. They're going to turn on each other, on me, on anyone they see as a threat to their piece of the pie. You just started a war, Emma. She met his eyes, unflinching. Better a war you can fight than a bullet you can't dodge. He almost laughed. It would have been the first real laugh in years, bitter and bright. Instead, he reached out and gently brushed a wet strand of hair from her face, a gesture so uncharacteristic that it surprised them both. You're either very brave or very foolish, he said softly. Maybe both, Emma whispered. The grandfather clock chimed midnight, its deep tones resonating through the house. Outside, the rain was easing, transitioning from a downpour to a steady drizzle. Chicago at night, Ryan thought, was a city of wet streets and neon reflections, of secrets kept and deals made in shadows. It was his city, his kingdom, and now it was slipping through his fingers like water. Get some rest, he told Emma, stepping back, reestablishing the distance between employer and employee, between the man he was and the man he might have been in another life. Tomorrow we figure out what comes next. She nodded and disappeared upstairs, leaving him alone in the hallway with the broken door and the weight of borrowed time. Ryan returned to his study, poured himself another whiskey, and sat down at his desk. He pulled out his phone and began making calls. If Emma's lie was going to become the truth everyone believed, then he needed to control the narrative, shape the story, turn a crisis into an opportunity. By dawn, the word had spread through the underground networks of Chicago. Ryan Callahan was dying, the Empire was vulnerable, and every ambitious soldier, every hungry lieutenant, every patient rival began to move, repositioning themselves for the chaos to come. Ryan stood at his window as the sun rose over Lake Michigan, turning the water from black to gray to brilliant gold. He had been given 3 months by Emma's lie, 3 months to set his house in order, to find out who had sent those gunmen, to decide what legacy he would leave behind. 3 months to figure out if redemption was possible for a man like him. And for the first time in 10 years, since Maria's death had hollowed him out and left him with nothing but ambition and rage, Ryan Callahan felt something stir in the emptiness. It wasn't hope. He knew better than to hope, but it was something close. Purpose, maybe, or just the simple, stubborn refusal to die on someone else's terms. The rain had stopped. The city was waking. And Ryan Callahan, the dying king of Chicago's underworld, began to plan his survival. The days following the incident moved with the slow, inevitable momentum of an avalanche. Ryan could feel the organization shifting beneath him, tectonic plates of loyalty and ambition grinding against each other, building pressure that would eventually explode into open conflict. Phone calls went unreturned. Meetings were postponed. Eyes that once met his directly now slid away, calculating and cautious. The word had spread exactly as he knew it would. Ryan Callahan was dying, and the vultures were gathering to feast on what remained. Emma moved through the house like a ghost, quiet and efficient, maintaining the rhythms of normal life, even as everything around them began to fracture. She brought him coffee in the mornings, prepared meals he barely touched, and asked no questions about the men who came and went at odd hours, about the hushed conversations that ended abruptly when she entered a room. But Ryan felt her presence like a constant weight, a reminder of the lie she had told and the debt he now owed. It was Friday afternoon, 5 days after the gunmen had walked into his house, when Marco Rossini arrived for their weekly meeting. Marco was 45, built like a brick wall, with scarred knuckles and eyes that had seen too much. He had been Ryan's lieutenant for 15 years, his most trusted soldier, the man who executed orders without question and kept the machinery of the Empire running smoothly. If anyone in the organization was loyal beyond doubt, it was Marco. They sat in the study, the afternoon light filtering through the curtains in dusty gold bars. Marco looked uncomfortable, shifting in his chair like a man preparing to deliver bad news. "Tell me," Ryan said, pouring them both whiskey. Marco took his glass, drank deep, then set it down with a heavy sigh. "It's bad, Ryan. Worse than I thought. Vincent Marconi has been meeting with some of your crew from the south side. Tommy Chen's been quiet, but his people are buying up real estate in territories we control. And Marco paused, his jaw tightening. Your cousin's been talking to the Mexicans, the cartels down south. He's positioning himself as your successor, telling people he's the natural choice when you're gone. Ryan absorbed this information without reaction, his face a mask. He had expected betrayal, but hearing it catalogued so precisely still carried a sting. Michael, his own blood, the boy he had mentored, protected, elevated within the organization. Of course it would be Michael. Ambition made men blind to loyalty, to history, to anything but the glittering promise of power. How long do we have before someone makes a move? Ryan asked. Weeks, Marco said grimly. Maybe less. Everyone's waiting to see if you're really sick, if you're really going to die. The moment they're sure you're weak, they'll come for everything. Ryan stood and walked to the window, looking out at the manicured garden behind his house. October in Chicago meant dying leaves and early frost, nature preparing for winter's small death. He thought about Maria, buried in Graceland Cemetery on the north side, her grave marked by a simple stone that read, "Beloved wife." He thought about the years since her death, the violence and money and hollow victories that had filled the space she left behind. He thought about Emma, standing in the hallway with her hands raised, offering him borrowed time. Set up a meeting, Ryan said quietly. All of them. Vincent, Tommy, Michael. Tell them I want to talk about transition, about making this smooth. Tell them I'm ready to discuss terms. Marco's eyes widened. Ryan, that's insane. You put all of them in the same room, you're begging for a bloodbath. And if they think you're weak, they already think I'm weak, Ryan interrupted, turning from the window. The question is whether I'm weak enough to kill or weak enough to negotiate with. I need to know which, and I need to know who sent those gunmen. It was Michael, Marco said flatly. I'm 90% sure. The timing, the resources, the way he's been moving since, it all points to him. Ryan nodded slowly. He had reached the same conclusion, but hearing it confirmed still felt like swallowing ground glass. Then we need to be very careful, Marco, because if Michael made one move, he's already planning the next. And this time, he won't send strangers. He'll send people I trust. Marco's hand drifted unconsciously to the gun at his waist. You can trust me, Ryan. You know that. I know, Ryan said and meant it. But Michael doesn't know I know. So we're going to use that. Set up the meeting for tomorrow night. Somewhere neutral. The old warehouse on Ashland. The one we used for the Hernandez negotiation. Bring 6 men. No more. Keep it small. Keep it tight. After Marco left, Ryan sat in the gathering darkness, thinking through angles and possibilities. The warehouse meeting was a risk, but calculated. If Michael was behind the assassination attempt, he would see this as an opportunity, a chance to finish what he had started. But if Ryan could control the environment, anticipate the moves, he might be able to turn the trap back on the trapper. A soft knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Emma stood in the doorway, backlit by the hallway light, her small frame casting a long shadow. Are you hungry? She asked, and there was something in her voice, a gentleness that cut through his calculations and strategies, and reminded him that he was still human, still capable of simple needs like hunger and warmth. Yeah, Ryan said, surprising himself. I am. They ate together at the kitchen table, a small intimacy that violated every rule he had set for himself. Employers didn't dine with their staff. Kings didn't break bread with servants. But Emma moved through the kitchen with quiet confidence, preparing a simple meal of pasta and salad, pouring wine, and somehow, without words, creating a space that felt almost normal, almost safe. They're going to try again, aren't they? Emma asked as they ate. The men who came here. Ryan considered lying, protecting her from the truth, but she had earned honesty. Yes, he said, but not them specifically. Others. People I know. People who think I'm too weak to fight back. Are you? She asked, meeting his eyes. Too weak? I don't know, Ryan admitted, and the confession felt like peeling away armor plate by plate. I've been strong for so long, Emma. I've been the man everyone fears, the man who never loses. But strength is exhausting, and sometimes I wonder if I've been strong for so long that I've forgotten how to be anything else. Emma reached across the table and placed her hand over his, a simple gesture that carried the weight of galaxies. Strength isn't just about not breaking, she said softly. Sometimes strength is knowing when to bend, when to ask for help, when to let people in. Ryan looked at their hands, hers small and pale, his scarred and calloused. Why do you stay? He asked. After what happened, after what you saw, why don't you leave? Get away from this house, from me, from all of this. Emma was quiet for a long moment, her thumb tracing small circles on the back of his hand. Because I think you're trying to find your way back to something, she said finally. "I think you've been lost for a long time, and you're starting to realize it. And maybe, in some small way, I can help you find your way home." The words hung in the air between them, fragile and impossibly brave. Ryan felt something shift in his chest, some long-frozen thing beginning to thaw. It would have been so easy to pull her close, to seek comfort in her warmth, to pretend for one night that he was something other than a dying king in a crumbling empire. But he didn't. Instead, he squeezed her hand gently, and then let go, preserving the distance that kept her safe from the darkness that followed him like a shadow. "Tomorrow might get dangerous," he said. "I have a meeting. If something goes wrong, Marco has instructions. There's money set aside for you, enough to start over somewhere far from Chicago. Promise me that if things go bad, you'll take it and go." Emma shook her head, stubborn fire flashing in her eyes. "I'm not leaving you, Mr. Callahan. Ryan," he said quietly. "If we're going to do this, if you're really going to stay, then call me Ryan." She smiled, small and sad and beautiful. "Okay, Ryan." That night, as Chicago settled into its familiar patterns of neon and shadow, Ryan lay awake in his bed, staring at the ceiling. He thought about the meeting tomorrow, about Michael's ambition, and Vincent's greed, and Tommy's cold calculation. He thought about the empire he had built from blood and fear, and whether it was worth preserving, or whether it should be allowed to crumble into dust. And he thought about Emma, sleeping somewhere in this big house, a bright thread of genuine humanity in the dark tapestry of his life. The grandfather clock chimed 3 a.m, marking the slow passage of borrowed time. Ryan closed his eyes and began to prepare himself for what was coming. Tomorrow, in a warehouse on Ashland Avenue, the serpent in his garden would show itself, and when it did, Ryan Callahan would be ready. The warehouse on Ashland Avenue squatted in the industrial wasteland, like a forgotten monument to Chicago's manufacturing past. Rust stained its corrugated walls, and broken windows gaped like empty eye sockets. Inside, the vast space smelled of motor oil and decay, concrete floors cracked by decades of freeze-thaw cycles. Ryan had chosen it precisely because it was neutral territory, a place where no one held advantage, where violence would be obvious and unavoidable if it came. He arrived at 8 p.m. on Saturday, Marco and 6 soldiers forming a protective circle around him. Vincent Marconi was already there, leaning against a stack of shipping pallets with 4 of his men, smoking a cigarette and watching the entrance with hooded eyes. Vincent was 58, overweight, with the kind of jovial face that hid a calculating mind. He nodded at Ryan, a gesture of respect between old adversaries. Tommy Chen arrived 15 minutes later, moving with the precise economy of a man who wasted nothing. Not words, not movements, not opportunities. He was younger than Ryan by 5 years, slender and impeccably dressed in a tailored suit that looked out of place in the grimy warehouse. His 3 bodyguards fanned out in perfect formation, professional and alert. Michael came last, and Ryan felt something twist in his chest at the sight of his cousin. Michael was 34, handsome in a weak-chinned way, with Ryan's dark hair and Maria's green eyes, a reminder of family gatherings decades ago, of Christmas dinners and summer barbecues when life had been simpler, and bloodshed had been something that happened to other people. But ambition had carved away the boy Ryan remembered, leaving behind a hungry stranger wearing a familiar face. "Ryan," Michael said, spreading his arms in a gesture of false warmth. "You look terrible, cousin. I heard about the cancer. I'm sorry." The lie hung in the air like smoke. Ryan studied his cousin's face, looking for any crack in the performance, any hint of guilt or uncertainty. There was nothing. Michael had committed to his role completely, the grieving family member saddened by inevitable loss, positioning himself as the natural heir to the throne he was trying to steal. "Let's talk," Ryan said, his voice flat. He gestured to a cleared space in the center of the warehouse where 5 folding chairs had been arranged in a rough circle. The men sat, a council of wolves negotiating over territory and blood, while their soldiers maintained watch from the perimeter. "I'm dying," Ryan began, deciding to lean into the lie Emma had created, to use it as both shield and weapon. "You all know that by now. The doctors say I have weeks, maybe a couple months if I'm lucky. So we need to talk about succession, about how this transition happens without tearing apart everything we've built." Vincent crushed out his cigarette under his heel. "With respect, Ryan, what we've built is what you've built. The rest of us have been working under your thumb for years. Maybe it's time the power gets distributed more evenly. Or maybe it's time for new blood, Tommy said quietly, his voice carrying the faint accent of a Cantonese childhood. Someone younger, someone who understands how the world is changing. No offense, Ryan, but your methods are old school. The future belongs to people who can adapt. Michael leaned forward, his face arranged in an expression of concerned family loyalty. I think what everyone's trying to say, Ryan, is that we need clarity. You can't run things from a hospital bed. Someone needs to step up, take the reins, keep everything stable. And as your cousin, as family, I think I'm the logical choice. There it was, the play, made openly in front of witnesses, establishing Michael's claim for all to see. Ryan watched his cousin's face and felt a deep, abiding sadness settle over him. This was what his empire had created. Men so hungry for power that they would circle a dying man like sharks scenting blood in the water, willing to tear apart family and loyalty and history for a chance to sit on a throne built from corpses and cash. The logical choice, Ryan repeated softly. Tell me, Michael, did you think you were the logical choice when you sent 3 men to my house 5 days ago? When you hired outside contractors to put bullets in my head before the cancer could do the job? The temperature in the warehouse dropped 10 degrees. Vincent and Tommy tensed, hands moving toward concealed weapons. Michael's face went blank, a mask slipping into place but not fast enough. For one fraction of a second, Ryan saw panic in his cousin's eyes, the flash of a cornered animal realizing the trap has been sprung. I don't know what you're talking about, Michael said, but his voice carried a tremor that betrayed him. 3 men, Ryan continued, his tone conversational, almost gentle. Good professionals. They broke through my front door, came in with silenced weapons, ready to execute me in my own home. But something interesting happened. My maid, a 24-year-old girl from Tennessee, stepped between us and told them I was dying, told them they were wasting bullets on a corpse, and they believed her. They left. Isn't that strange? Maybe they had mercy, Michael said, recovering slightly. Maybe they decided killing a dying man wasn't worth the risk. Ryan shook his head slowly. No, Michael. They left because their employer hadn't told them about the cancer. They left because you sent them before Emma's lie spread through the organization. You moved too fast, cousin. You got impatient, and now we're here. Michael stood abruptly, his chair scraping against concrete. This is bullshit. You're paranoid, Ryan. The cancer's making you see conspiracies where there aren't any. Sit down, Ryan said, and there was enough steel in his voice that Michael hesitated. We're not done. Marco had moved behind Michael, one hand resting casually on his weapon. Vincent and Tommy watched the confrontation with intense interest, calculating how this shift in power dynamics affected their own positions. The soldiers on the perimeter had gone still, waiting for the signal that would transform conversation into bloodshed. Here's what's going to happen, Ryan said, his voice carrying across the warehouse. Michael, you're out. You're done. You're going to leave Chicago tonight, and you're not coming back. I'll give you enough money to start somewhere else, but you're out of the organization. Permanently. You can't do that, Michael snarled, his careful mask finally cracking. Half your crew is already with me. You're weak, you're dying, and you can't hold what you've built. I'm taking it, Ryan, with or without your blessing. The admission hung in the air, confirming what Ryan had already known, but hearing it spoken aloud still carried power. The weight of betrayal made concrete. Ryan stood slowly, facing his cousin across 3 feet of concrete and 34 years of shared history. You want it? Ryan asked softly. Then take it. Right here, right now. Pull your weapon and take your shot. If you're fast enough, lucky enough, if your men are better than mine, then you win. You get the Empire, and I get to die a little ahead of schedule. Is that what you want? Michael's hand moved toward his waist, hovering over the grip of his pistol. The warehouse held its breath. Ryan could see the calculation in his cousin's eyes, weighing odds, measuring distances, considering whether the chance of success was worth the certainty of violence. For a long moment, the future balanced on the edge of that decision. Then Tommy Chen spoke, his voice cutting through the tension. Or, Tommy said carefully, we could avoid turning this warehouse into a slaughterhouse and consider other options. Ryan, you're right that Michael moved against you. But Michael's also right that you can't run things while you're dying. So why don't we do this differently? Vincent and I take over the major operations, split the territories. Michael gets a small piece, enough to keep him quiet. And you, Ryan, you get to fade away with dignity, knowing your empire outlived you. It was a reasonable offer, a solution that prevented immediate violence while redistributing power in a way that satisfied most appetites. Vincent was nodding, seeing the logic. Michael's hand moved away from his weapon, considering the compromise. But Ryan shook his head. "No," he said flatly, "because I'm not dying." Silence. The kind of silence that precedes earthquakes and revelations. "The cancer," Ryan continued, his voice steady and clear, "was a lie. A beautiful, desperate lie told by a young woman trying to save my life. There is no diagnosis, no doctors, no 3-month countdown. I'm perfectly healthy. Which means, gentlemen, that you've all just revealed exactly how you'd behave if I showed weakness. You've shown me who you really are, and now I have to decide what to do about that." Michael's face went white. Vincent cursed under his breath. Tommy Chen simply smiled, a cold expression that held neither humor nor warmth. "That," Tommy said quietly, "was very clever, Ryan, and very dangerous." "Yes," Ryan agreed. "It was." Michael pulled his weapon in a blur of motion, rage and panic overriding calculation. But Marco was faster, his gun clearing leather and barking twice before Michael could bring his pistol to bear. The shots echoed through the warehouse like thunder, and Michael stumbled backward, red blooming across his white shirt, his weapon clattering to the concrete. He fell to his knees, gasping, his eyes wide with shock and betrayal, and then toppled sideways. Still, the warehouse exploded into chaos. Michael's men drew weapons. Marco's soldiers returned fire. Vincent and Tommy dove for cover as the space filled with muzzle flashes and the deafening roar of gunfire. Ryan dropped behind a steel support pillar, his own weapon in hand, returning fire with mechanical precision. It wasn't how he had wanted this to end, but it was how it always ended. Violence, breeding violence, blood calling for blood, the cycle perpetuating itself with ruthless inevitability. The firefight lasted less than 30 seconds. When the echoes faded, 3 of Michael's men were down. One of Marco's soldiers was clutching a shoulder wound, and the air smelled of cordite and death. Vincent and Tommy had disappeared into the shadows, escaping through side exits before the situation deteriorated further. Smart men, Ryan thought distantly. Survivors. He walked to where Michael lay, his cousin's blood spreading in a dark pool on the concrete. Michael's eyes were open, fading fast, and Ryan knelt beside him, feeling the weight of 34 years of history pressing down on his shoulders. "I'm sorry," Ryan said, and meant it. "I'm sorry it came to this." Michael's lips moved, forming words that came out as wet whispers. "You were already dead. Inside. I was just making it official." Then Michael's eyes went empty, and Ryan's last living blood relation left the world, leaving behind nothing but questions about what Ryan had become, and whether redemption was even possible for men like them. Marco approached, his face grim. "Ryan, we need to move. Someone's going to have called the cops. We've got maybe 10 minutes before this place is swarming." But Ryan stayed kneeling beside his cousin's body, feeling something break inside him that had nothing to do with bullets or betrayal. He thought of Emma, waiting at the house, believing that borrowed time could somehow lead to salvation. He thought of Maria, dead 10 years, spared from seeing what he had become. And he thought of the empire he had built, the kingdom of fear and violence that had cost him everything that mattered. His wife, his family, his soul. "Get everyone out," Ryan said quietly. "Clean this up. I need to think." He stood and walked toward the exit, leaving behind the warehouse and the bodies and the smoking wreckage of everything he had thought he wanted. Outside, Chicago sparkled in the night, indifferent to the small tragedy that had just played out in its industrial shadows. Ryan got into his car and drove, not toward home, but toward Graceland Cemetery on the north side. He arrived at Maria's grave just before midnight, the cemetery silent and still under a crescent moon. He knelt on the damp grass beside her headstone, and for the first time since her funeral, Ryan Callahan allowed himself to cry. For her, for Michael, for the man he had been before grief and rage had consumed him, for the wasted years and borrowed time and beautiful lies that couldn't save anyone in the end. "I don't know how to fix this," he whispered to the stone and the woman beneath it. "I don't know how to be anything other than what I am." The cemetery offered no answers, only silence and the distant sound of traffic on Clark Street. Ryan stayed there until dawn, kneeling in the grass, mourning everything he had lost and everything he had become. And when the sun finally rose over Lake Michigan, turning the sky from black to gray to gold, he drove home to face whatever came next, carrying the weight of Michael's death like a stone in his chest. Emma was waiting when Ryan walked through the door at 7 a.m. She stood in the hallway, still in her nightgown and robe, her face pale with worry. One look at him, at the blood on his hands that he had forgotten to wash, at the hollow devastation in his eyes, and she knew something terrible had happened. "Is he dead?" she asked quietly. Not what happened, not "are you okay?" but the question that cut straight to the truth. She had lived in his house long enough to understand the language of violence, to read the signs written in blood and silence. Ryan nodded slowly, his voice a rough whisper. "Michael, my cousin. He tried to kill me and Marco shot him. It happened so fast." Emma crossed the distance between them in 3 steps and wrapped her arms around him, pulling him close despite the blood, despite the danger, despite everything that logic and self-preservation demanded. Ryan stood rigid for a moment, shocked by the contact, then slowly, carefully, allowed himself to sink into her embrace. She was small and warm and alive, and he buried his face in her hair and let himself be held by someone who saw the monster and stayed anyway. They stood like that for a long time, morning light filtering through the windows, the house silent around them. Finally, Emma pulled back, her hands on his face, forcing him to meet her eyes. "You need to clean up," she said gently, "and then you need to tell me everything." He showered, scrubbing the blood from his hands until the water ran clear, then dressed in fresh clothes and met Emma in the kitchen. She had made coffee, strong and black, and they sat across from each other as Ryan recounted the warehouse meeting, Michael's betrayal, the firefight, the empty look in his cousin's eyes as life drained away. Emma listened without interrupting, her hands wrapped around her coffee mug, absorbing the story with a kind of quiet strength that made Ryan marvel at her resilience. "What happens now?" she asked when he finished. "War," Ryan said flatly. "Vincent and Tommy saw the whole thing. They know I lied about the cancer, which means they know I set up Michael to expose himself. They're going to see that as weakness, as vulnerability. They'll move against me, probably within days. And this time, they won't send 3 men. They'll come with everything they have." Emma was quiet for a moment, thinking. "Then you have to move first," she said. "You have to take the fight to them before they bring it to you." Ryan shook his head. "I'm tired, Emma. I've been fighting my whole life. I've built this empire on blood and fear. And for what? Maria's dead. Michael's dead. Everyone I've ever cared about is gone, and I'm sitting in this big house all alone, waiting for the next assassination attempt. Maybe it's time to just let it go. Let them have it. Walk away." "And do what?" Emma challenged, her voice sharp. "Live on a beach somewhere, pretending you're not who you are? Ryan, you can't run from yourself, but you can choose what kind of man you want to be in the time you have left. You can let the empire tear itself apart, or you can try to build something better from the wreckage." "What if I don't know how?" Ryan asked, and the vulnerability in his voice was raw and real. "What if I've been this thing for so long that I can't be anything else?" Emma reached across the table and took his hand. "Then you learn. You try. You fail and get back up and try again. That's what courage is, Ryan. Not never being afraid. Not never making mistakes. It's choosing to be better even when you don't know if you can." Before Ryan could respond, his phone buzzed on the table. A text from Marco. "Police found the warehouse. They're calling it gang violence. No witnesses. But Vincent's crew hit one of our operations on the south side an hour ago. 3 dead. This is starting." Ryan read the message aloud, then looked at Emma. "It's starting," he said. "The war I've been dreading." "Then end it," Emma said simply. "Not with more violence. With something they won't expect. Offer them a way out. Give them a reason to stop fighting. They want power," Ryan said. "That's all men like Vincent and Tommy understand. How do I give them that, without giving them everything?" Emma was quiet, and Ryan could almost see her mind working, turning over possibilities. Then her eyes lit up with an idea that was either brilliant or insane. "You restructure," she said. "You turn your empire into a partnership. You give Vincent and Tommy real power, real territories, real autonomy, but you keep enough control to prevent them from destroying each other. You become the arbiter instead of the king, the balance instead of the boot on everyone's neck." Ryan stared at her. Emma, that's not how this world works. You show weakness, you get devoured. You share power. You create rivals who'll eventually move against you. You're already showing weakness by fighting," Emma countered. "Every operation you lose, every man who dies, every dollar that goes to war instead of business, that's weakness. But if you offer them a deal from a position of strength, if you show them that partnership is more profitable than conflict, some of them might take it. And the ones who don't, well, then you know who your real enemies are. It was crazy. It violated every principle Ryan had built his empire on. But as he thought about it, turning the idea over in his mind, he began to see the logic. He couldn't win a three-way war, not with resources divided and loyalties uncertain, but he might be able to broker a peace, transform the organization from a dictatorship into something more distributed, more sustainable. It would mean giving up absolute control, admitting his own limitations, accepting that the future belonged to someone other than himself. But it might also mean survival, both for him and for the organization. "I'd need leverage," Ryan said slowly, thinking it through. "Something that makes them want to negotiate instead of fight." Emma smiled, small and fierce. "Then let's get you some leverage." They spent the rest of the day making calls, gathering information, pulling threads. Ryan reached out to contacts in city government, in law enforcement, in the financial sector, the web of legitimate and illegitimate connections that had supported his empire for years. He offered deals, called in favors, made promises, and slowly, piece by piece, a picture emerged. Vincent Marconi had been laundering money through a real estate development company on the north side. The records were sloppy, traceable. One anonymous tip to the FBI, and Vincent would be looking at federal charges. Tommy Chen had been importing heroin through the port of Chicago using a shipping company that Ryan's organization had helped finance. Cut off that pipeline, and Tommy's cash flow would dry up within weeks. Both men had vulnerabilities, pressure points that Ryan could exploit without firing a single shot. By evening, Ryan had what he needed. He called Marco and told him to set up another meeting, this time at a restaurant in the Loop, somewhere public where violence would be difficult and expensive. Then he sat down to write out the proposal, the terms of a new arrangement that would transform his empire from a kingdom into a confederation. Emma read over his shoulder as he typed, occasionally suggesting changes, smoothing the language, making the offer more appealing without giving away too much. When it was finished, Ryan leaned back and looked at her. "This is either going to work," he said, "or it's going to get me killed." "It's going to work," Emma said, with a confidence that Ryan wished he felt, "because you're offering them something they want more than your death. You're offering them a future." The meeting was set for Monday night at Gibson's Bar and Steakhouse on Rush Street, an upscale establishment where Chicago's elite mingled with tourists and businessmen. Ryan arrived early, taking a private room in the back. Marco and 4 soldiers positioned discreetly throughout the restaurant. Vincent and Tommy arrived within minutes of each other, both clearly suspicious, both flanked by their own security. They sat at a round table, expensive steaks and whiskey ordered but untouched. 3 predators circling each other with words instead of weapons. Ryan laid out his proposal methodically, point by point. He would divide Chicago into 3 territories, each controlled by one of them. Shared operations would require consensus. Disputes would be arbitrated by a council of the 3 bosses, and anyone who broke the agreement, who tried to seize more than their share, would face not just one enemy, but 2. "You're asking us to trust each other," Vincent said flatly. "After everything that's happened, after Michael, after the warehouse, you're asking for trust." "I'm asking for pragmatism," Ryan corrected. "We can fight until we're all dead or imprisoned, until the organization tears itself apart and outsiders move in to take what we've destroyed. Or we can build something that lasts, something that survives us." Tommy Chen studied Ryan with those sharp, calculating eyes. "And what happens when you recover from your cancer and decide you want your empire back?" Ryan met Tommy's gaze steadily. "I'm not recovering because I was never sick. You know that. I used the lie to flush out Michael, and it worked. But it also showed me something, Tommy. It showed me that holding on to power with an iron fist eventually means crushing everything you're trying to protect. I'm 42 years old. I've spent half my life building this empire, and I have nothing to show for it, except a big empty house and a pile of bodies. I'm tired of being king. I want to be something else, something better." "Like what?" Vincent asked, skepticism dripping from every word. "Like a man who leaves behind something worth remembering," Ryan said quietly. "A structure that works, not just for me, but for all of us. A way of doing business that doesn't require constantly watching your back for the next betrayal. I know it sounds naive. I know it's not how this world works. But I'm offering it anyway, because the alternative is mutual destruction. and I'm done destroying things." The silence that followed was heavy with consideration. Vincent and Tommy exchanged glances, some unspoken communication passing between them. Finally, Tommy spoke. "3 territories," he said. "Equal shares on joint operations, council arbitration on disputes, and you guarantee the FBI backs off on my shipping company." "Done," Ryan said. "And I want assurances on the real estate developments," Vincent added. "No federal attention, no investigations." "Done," Ryan agreed. "I have the leverage to make both those problems disappear, but in return, you honor the agreement. No moves against each other, no proxy wars, no quiet assassinations." Vincent and Tommy looked at each other again, then back at Ryan. "One condition," Tommy said. "We want the Maid." Ryan's blood turned to ice. "What?" "The girl who started all this," Tommy continued, his voice casual, almost friendly. "Emma. We want her as insurance. She stays with Vincent for the first 6 months, then with me for the next 6. That way, we know you'll honor the agreement, because if you don't, she pays the price." "No," Ryan said flatly. "She's not part of this. She's innocent." "Nobody's innocent," Vincent said, leaning forward. "And if you really want this peace, Ryan, if you really want this partnership, then you need to give us something that shows you're serious. The girl's the proof that you mean what you say." Ryan felt rage building in his chest, hot and dangerous. Emma had saved his life, had offered him a chance at redemption, and now these animals wanted to use her as a bargaining chip, a hostage to ensure his good behavior. Every instinct screamed at him to refuse, to flip the table and let the violence come. But then he thought about what Emma had said that morning. "You can choose what kind of man you want to be." He looked at Marco, saw the same fury reflected in his lieutenant's eyes. He thought about the organization, the structure they were trying to build, and he made a choice that felt like tearing out his own heart. "I'll ask her," Ryan said quietly. "But the choice is hers. If she refuses, we find another way. If she agrees, you treat her with respect, keep her safe, and return her unharmed when the year is over. Those are my terms." Vincent and Tommy nodded, satisfied. They shook hands, sealing the agreement, and left the restaurant with their security details. Ryan sat alone at the table, staring at his untouched steak, feeling like he had just sold his soul for the illusion of peace. Marco sat down across from him. "You can't ask her to do that, Ryan. It's not right." "I know," Ryan whispered, "but I'm going to anyway, because if I don't, this peace fails, and everyone dies, including her." He drove home through Chicago's nighttime streets, the city a blur of lights and shadows. When he walked into the house, Emma was waiting in the study, sitting in his chair, reading one of his books. She looked up as he entered, and the hope in her eyes nearly broke him. "It worked?" she asked. "They want you," Ryan said, the words scraping his throat raw, "as insurance. They want you to stay with them for a year, 6 months each with Vincent and Tommy, to make sure I honor the agreement." Emma went very still, the book sliding forgotten from her hands. "And you told them no." "I told them I'd ask you," Ryan said, "and that the choice was yours. But Emma, you need to understand what this means. These are dangerous men. They'll treat you like property, like a tool to use against me. I can't guarantee your safety. I can't protect you from them. So if you say no, I will burn their entire world down to keep you safe. But if you say yes..." He couldn't finish the sentence. Emma stood and crossed to him, her face calm and resolved. "If I say yes, you get your peace. You get your chance to build something better. You get to be the man you're trying to become." "It's too much," Ryan said desperately. "I can't ask this of you." "You're not asking," Emma said gently. "I'm offering. Just like I offered to lie for you when those gunmen came. Just like I'm offering now to be the thing that holds this piece together. Because I believe in you, Ryan. I believe you can be better than what you've been. And if this is the price of that belief, then I'll pay it." Ryan pulled her close, holding her like she was the last solid thing in a collapsing world. "I will get you back," he promised into her hair. "No matter what it takes, no matter how long, I will honor this agreement, and I will get you back. And when this year is over, if you still want anything to do with me, I'll spend the rest of my life being worthy of your faith." Emma pulled back, her hands on his face, and kissed him, fierce and sweet, and achingly brief. "Then you better start now," she whispered. 2 days later, Emma left with Vincent Marconi's men, a single suitcase in her hand, and a forced smile on her lips. Ryan watched from the window as the car pulled away, disappearing into Chicago's morning traffic, and for the second time in a week, he allowed himself to cry, grieving for the good thing he had just lost, and praying to a God he didn't believe in, that he would somehow find a way to deserve her faith. The grandfather clock ticked in the study, marking time, and Ryan Callahan, alone in his fortress once more, began the hard work of becoming the man Emma believed he could be. The year that followed was the longest of Ryan Callahan's life. He transformed his empire with methodical precision, implementing the three-territory structure, establishing the arbitration council, and slowly, painfully, learning to share power instead of hoarding it. Vincent and Tommy honored the agreement, more or less, their ambitions checked by mutual suspicion, and the understanding that breaking the peace would benefit neither of them. The organization stabilized, profits increased, and violence decreased to levels not seen in a decade. But every day, Ryan thought about Emma. He received updates from Vincent's people for the first 6 months, brief confirmations that she was alive and unharmed. She was working as a housekeeper in Vincent's North Side mansion, treated with cautious respect, neither prisoner nor guest, but something in between. Ryan sent messages through intermediaries, careful words that said, "I remember my promise and this will end." He didn't know if she received them. When the 6 months ended and Emma transferred to Tommy Chen's custody, the updates stopped. Tommy was more secretive, more paranoid, and for 3 months Ryan heard nothing. The silence ate at him, eroding the careful control he had built. He threw himself into the work of restructuring, of making the organization legitimate, of washing away years of blood with layers of corporate paperwork and charitable donations. He visited Maria's grave every Sunday, talking to her about Emma, about redemption, about whether men like him could ever really change. Marco watched him with concern, seeing his boss transform from ruthless king to something quieter, more contemplative, more human. "You're in love with her," Marco said one evening as they reviewed quarterly reports in the study. Ryan didn't deny it. "I don't know if I'm capable of love anymore, Marco, but I know that she saw something in me worth saving, and I'm trying to be that thing, even if I'm not sure it exists." "It exists," Marco said quietly. "I've seen it. You're not the same man you were a year ago, Ryan. You're better." Spring arrived in Chicago, turning the city green and alive. Ryan marked the days until Emma's year of captivity would end, a prisoner of his own guilt and hope. He prepared the house for her return, hiring contractors to repair the front door that had never been properly fixed, repainting the hallways, filling the rooms with light and warmth. He didn't know if she would come back to him, but he wanted to be ready if she did. The day of her release was a Tuesday in May, warm and bright, the kind of day that made Chicago feel like the most beautiful city in the world. Ryan drove to Tommy Chen's building in Chinatown alone, parking on Wentworth Avenue and walking to the address he had memorized a year ago. Tommy met him at the door, his expression unreadable. "She fulfilled the agreement," Tommy said. "She's upstairs, packing her things. You should know, Callahan. She's stronger than we thought. Vincent and we tried to find weaknesses, leverage to use against you, but she never broke, never complained, never gave us anything. You chose well." Ryan climbed the stairs to the 3rd floor, his heart hammering in his chest. He knocked on the door, heard Emma's voice say, "Come in," and entered to find her standing by a window, looking out over the neighborhood. She had changed, thinner, quieter, with shadows under her eyes that hadn't been there before. But when she turned to face him, her smile was genuine, weary, but real. "Ryan," she said, and the sound of his name in her voice was the most beautiful thing he had ever heard. "I came to take you home," he said. "If you want to come, if you'll have me." Emma crossed the room and took his hand, lacing her fingers through his. "I knew you would," she said softly. "I never doubted it, not once." They drove back to the brownstone on North Burling Street in comfortable silence, the morning light turning the city gold around them. When they arrived, Emma stopped in the doorway, looking at the repaired entrance, the fresh paint, the transformation of the space from fortress to home. "You changed it," she said wonderingly. "I changed everything," Ryan replied. "The house, the organization, myself. I tried, Emma. I tried to be the man you believed I could be. I don't know if I succeeded, but I tried." Emma turned to face him, her hand still in his. "Tell me," she said. "Tell me everything that happened this year." They sat in the study, the afternoon light filtering through the curtains. and Ryan recounted the 12 months that had passed. He told her about the restructuring, about learning to compromise and delegate, about the council meetings where he had to negotiate instead of command. He told her about visiting Maria's grave, about the conversations he'd had with a ghost about guilt and redemption and second chances. He told her about the nightmares he'd had, visions of her suffering while he remained powerless to help, and he told her about the man he was trying to become, someone who built instead of destroyed, who created value instead of extracting it through fear. Emma listened, her eyes never leaving his face, absorbing the story of his transformation. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment, thinking. "You know what I realized this year?" she said finally. "Strength isn't about never being afraid or never making mistakes. It's about choosing to try anyway. You were already strong when I met you, Ryan, but you were strong in the old way, the way that destroys everything around it eventually. Now you're learning a different kind of strength, the kind that bends instead of breaks, the kind that builds instead of tears down." "I don't know if I can maintain it," Ryan admitted. "Some days I feel like I'm betraying everything I built, everything I was. Some days I want to go back to the old way, where everything was simple and clear. But you don't," Emma said gently. "That's what matters. You feel the pull of the old life, but you choose the new one anyway. That's courage, Ryan. That's real change." He reached out and cupped her face in his hands, marveling at her resilience, her faith, her impossible bravery. "I love you," he said, the words feeling strange and new in his mouth. "I don't know if I'm capable of loving someone the way they deserve, but I love you, and I want to spend whatever time I have left proving that you were right to believe in me." Emma's eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling. "I love you too," she whispered. "I loved you when I lied to those gunmen. I loved you when I agreed to be Vincent and Tommy's hostage. I loved you every day of this year, even when I was scared and alone, because I could feel you out here, fighting to become better, and I want to spend my life watching you become the man you're meant to be." They kissed then, a kiss that tasted of salt, and hope, and hard-won redemption. When they finally pulled apart, Ryan rested his forehead against hers, breathing her in, feeling more alive than he had in decades. "What do we do now?" he asked. Emma smiled. "Now we live," she said simply. "We build a life together. We figure out who we are when we're not fighting or running or trying to survive. We just live." That evening, they had dinner together at the kitchen table. A simple meal prepared by two people learning to be normal, to be domestic, to be something other than what the world had tried to make them. They talked about the future, about maybe leaving Chicago someday, about the possibility of children, about growing old together in a house that felt like home instead of a fortress. Later, as the sun set over Lake Michigan and the city lights began to glow, Ryan took Emma's hand and led her to the study. The grandfather clock stood in the corner, still ticking, still marking time's inexorable passage. But now, instead of sounding like a countdown to death, it sounded like the heartbeat of a life still being lived. "This clock," Ryan said, "was the only thing in this house that reminded me time was still moving after Maria died. I used to sit here and listen to it, feeling like I was already dead inside, just waiting for my body to catch up. And now?" Emma asked. "Now it sounds different," Ryan said. "Now it sounds like possibility. Like all the moments we have ahead of us, ticking by 1 second at a time. Like borrowed time that became real time, that became the rest of our lives." Emma leaned into him, resting her head on his shoulder. "Then let's make every second count," she said. Outside, Chicago settled into its nighttime rhythms, a city of 9 million stories and 1 million small redemptions. Inside the brownstone on North Burling Street, Ryan Callahan and Emma sat together in the gathering darkness, listening to the clock tick, counting not the time they had lost, but the time they had found. The rain that had fallen on the night 3 gunmen walked into his house had washed away more than just dust and grime. It had washed away the old Ryan, the king who ruled through fear, leaving behind a man learning to rule himself with compassion and hope. The empire he had built would outlast him, transformed into something more sustainable, more humane. Vincent and Tommy would honor their agreement more or less, because peace was profitable and war was expensive. And somewhere in the future, when Ryan and Emma were old and gray, they would look back on this moment, this evening in May when everything changed, and remember that redemption is never easy, but it's always possible for those brave enough to try. The grandfather clock chimed 8 times, its deep tones resonating through the house. Ryan held Emma closer, feeling her warmth, her life, her faith in him made manifest in flesh and blood, and for the first time since Maria's death, he allowed himself to hope. Not the desperate hope of a drowning man grasping at straws, but the quiet, steady hope of someone who has found solid ground after years of falling. "Thank you," he whispered into Emma's hair. "Thank you for saving my life. Not once, but over and over again. Thank you for letting me." Emma whispered back, "Thank you for choosing to live." They sat like that as darkness fell completely. Two people who had found each other in the wreckage of a life built on violence and fear, and who had chosen, against all odds, to build something better. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be setbacks and mistakes, and days when the old darkness called to Ryan with seductive promises of simplicity and power. But he wouldn't walk that road alone. Emma would be beside him, and together, they would face whatever came next. The rain that had fallen on that October night a year ago had been cold and hard, a rain that hammered the streets and turned everything to gray. But the rain that began falling now, as Ryan and Emma sat together in the study, was softer, warmer, a spring rain that brought growth instead of erosion. Chicago received it gratefully, the parched earth drinking deep, preparing for summer's bloom. In the brownstone on North Burling Street, Ryan Callahan kissed Emma once more, sealing a promise that transcended words. Whatever time they had, weeks or years or decades, they would spend it becoming the people they were meant to be, together, building a life from the ruins of his empire and the courage of her heart. The grandfather clock ticked on, counting seconds into minutes into hours, marking the passage of borrowed time that had become real time, marking the transformation of a dying king into a man learning to truly live. And somewhere, in a cemetery on the north side, Maria's stone stood silent witness to the redemption of the man she had loved, finally finding his way home through the grace of a young woman who had seen his worth when even he had forgotten it existed. The gunfire that could have ended everything had been silenced by a truth spoken in desperation, and that truth, though born from a lie, had become the foundation of a life worth living, a love worth fighting for, and a redemption worth every sacrifice along the way. Thank you for listening to this story. If you enjoyed this journey of redemption and second chances, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more emotionally powerful stories. Share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear what resonated with you, and don't forget to tell me where in the world you're listening from. Your support helps me bring more compelling narratives to life. Until next time, remember that it's never too late to choose who you want to become.